A sudden, loud creak pulled me from a deep and restful sleep, jolting me upright. The sound echoed through the house, heavy and deliberate, like someone pacing downstairs in the living room. Turning over in bed, I glanced at my wife, Emma, who was peacefully asleep beside me. Nudging her shoulder gently, I whispered, "Emma, did you hear that?" She groaned, rolling away from me, mumbling, "Go back to bed, David. It's just those raccoons again." I sighed, trying to convince myself she was right, and settled back under the covers. But no sooner had I closed my eyes than a sharp, heavy thud reverberated through the house. This time, it was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was there. My heart pounded as a single question clawed its way into my mind. Was the sound inside or outside? Throwing off the blankets, I swung my legs out of bed and hurried to the closet. I shoved aside a row of hanging shirts and pressed my thumb against the biometric lock of my gun safe. With a soft click, it opened, and I retrieved my M4 shotgun. I racked around into the chamber and flicked on the flashlight mounted on the barrel. If it wasn't raccoons this time, I wasn't about to take any chances. After securing the safe again, I crept toward the bedroom door, pausing to listen. I held my breath, ears straining for any sound, but the house was unnervingly quiet. Deciding to investigate further, I opened the bedroom door slowly, peering into the dark hallway. Everything seemed as it should be. I would have heard someone trudging up the old wooden stairs, which creaked with even the slightest step. But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Taking cautious steps, I began descending to the main floor, the flashlight beam leading the way. No matter how softly I moved, the stairs betrayed me with their high-pitched groans. Reaching the bottom, I stood motionless, letting my eyes sweep the dimly lit living room. The silence was oppressive, and for a brief moment, I almost believed Emma's theory, just raccoons causing mischief. I was on the verge of retreating to the safety of my bed when a sudden, deafening crash erupted from the back of the house. It sounded like a tree had toppled onto the deck, and I couldn't fathom how Emma was still sound asleep upstairs. I tightened my grip on the shotgun and moved toward the kitchen, where the sliding glass doors led out to the deck. The noise had stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the night eerily quiet again. As I approached, a soft crunching sound reached my ears, faint but persistent. It was oddly soothing, almost enough to make me lower my guard. Emma must have been right, just some animal out for a midnight snack. Still, I figured a quick sweep with the flashlight would scare off whatever it was. I panned the light across the deck, expecting to see a raccoon scurrying away. But instead, the beam illuminated something far more grotesque. Standing there on the wooden planks were four thin, pale legs, supporting a misshapen sack of flesh. A long, sinewy neck extended upward, balancing an unnatural head with sagging, uneven features. Its hollow, sunken eyes locked onto me, and a raccoon's limp tail dangled from its gaping mouth. The thing's expression twisted into a ghastly approximation of a grin, the corner of its face lifting grotesquely. My body reacted before my mind could process what I was seeing. I braced the shotgun tightly against my shoulder and fired 2 quick rounds. The glass door exploded into shards as the buckshot tore through it. The sound of shattering glass merged with the blaring alarm of my phone, and I woke with a start, sitting upright in bed. Disoriented, I fumbled to silence the alarm, my heart hammering in my chest. Sweat dripped from my forehead as I tried to ground myself. Just a dream, David, it was just a dream. But the memory felt too vivid. My hands still trembled as if they'd held the shotgun, and my shoulder ached like I'd just fired it. Turning to Emma's side of the bed, I found it empty. Hoping she could help me shake the lingering unease, I dragged myself out of bed and got dressed. Everything felt heavy, like I was moving through molasses. the line between dream and reality blurring. Downstairs, Emma stood in the kitchen, spreading butter on toast. "You okay?" she asked, glancing up as I hovered near the sliding glass doors. "Yeah, I just had a bad dream," I muttered, my voice distant. Compelled to check the doors, I pressed my hand against the glass. It was solid, ordinary, yet the moment my fingers made contact, the memories from the dream came rushing back. Shaking my head, I turned and headed back upstairs, my feet moving on autopilot toward the closet. I opened the gun safe and stared at the shotgun inside, retracing every step from the night before. Picking it up, I felt the weight of the memory settle on me again. It wasn't real. I repeated it over and over, unloading the shotgun to count the rounds. Every shell was accounted for, leaving me feeling foolish for doubting myself. But as I placed the shells back in the gun safe, I noticed something odd. The box of ammunition on the bottom shelf sat slightly ajar. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I pulled it out. My heart sank as I counted the remaining shells. 2 were missing. Sarah Johnson began her mornings the same way almost every day, with a steaming cup of coffee and the scraps her youngest son refused to finish for breakfast. As she hurried him and her older daughter into the car, her priority was always the same: getting them to school on time. After dropping them off, Sarah lingered to chat with the PTA moms, catching up on the usual chatter. The conversations rarely deviated from gossip or plans for the next fundraiser. Who would bake what? How much money were they aiming to raise? The topics were predictable, but Sarah didn't mind the routine. "Hey, Sarah," a familiar voice interrupted her drifting thoughts. It was her childhood friend, Lisa, who had perfected the art of pulling her back into conversations she often zoned out of. "Huh? Oh, yeah?" Sarah blinked, clearing her throat as she looked up from her lukewarm coffee. Lisa, twirling a strand of her blonde hair around one finger, leaned in with a conspiratorial air. "So my neighbor, you know, the one with that fancy Tesla, invited me to join her book club. She says they've got this old book, one that's never been made public before." As Lisa glanced around at the other moms, trying to gauge their interest, they all politely declined. Sarah couldn't help but notice the flicker of disappointment in her friend's eyes. She placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder, offering a supportive smile. "I'll join the book club with you. I've got some free time in the evenings when Mark's home. He can handle the kids for a while." Lisa's face lit up instantly. "Thanks, Sarah. I knew I could count on you." With a nod, Sarah wrapped up her morning at the school and headed back home. The rest of her day passed as it often did, tidying up, crossing off her chore list, and planning meals for the week. When Mark got home with the kids, she greeted him at the door with a warm hug and asked how his day had been. "Work," he said with a tired shrug, his standard response. Sarah held his hand for a moment, giving him a knowing smile, before he disappeared upstairs for a quick shower. During dinner, as they passed the meatloaf and green beans around the table, she casually mentioned the book club. "Lisa asked me to join a book club with her," she said, poking at her vegetables. Mark paused, tilting his head as he chewed thoughtfully. "Lisa? The blonde? Huh. Didn't think she was much of a reader." Their kids giggled at his comment, and Sarah frowned, giving him a playful scolding. "Mark." He smirked and took another bite, washing it down with a sip of his drink. Mark had never been Lisa's biggest fan. Back in high school, when Sarah introduced him as her boyfriend, Lisa's clingy nature had rubbed him the wrong way. "She's always getting you mixed up in something," he'd warned back then. But Mark gave her a small nod. "If you want to go, I'll take care of the kids." "Thanks, Han." The next day, Sarah met up with Lisa, and the two of them walked to the neighbor's house together. A tall woman with sleek, jet-black hair pulled into a high ponytail greeted them at the door. Her warm smile faltered when her eyes landed on Sarah. "Oh, you brought a guest," the woman said, her tone a little too cool. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "Is that all right? Sorry, I should have asked." The woman waved it off. "It's fine. The more, the merrier," she replied, though her forced smile made Sarah uneasy. As they stepped inside, Lisa gave Sarah a reassuring look, and they followed her into the living room where a small group of women had already gathered. "Everyone, this is Lisa and—" the hostess trailed off, looking at Sarah expectantly. "Sarah Johnson," she supplied. "Mrs. Johnson," the woman said flatly, barely masking her irritation. A few women offered polite greetings, but most turned their attention back to Lisa. Sarah couldn't shake the weird vibe. She was used to Lisa being the center of attention wherever they went, but this felt different. The group's fixation on Lisa seemed unnatural. "Is this even a real book club?" Sarah wondered. "Or is this some strange cult?" The hostess clapped her hands. "All right, let's get started," she said, lifting an old leather-bound tome. The book's cover was scarred and worn, its lock long broken. As she opened it, the air filled with a musty, decayed smell. The yellowed pages crinkled as she began to read in a language Sarah couldn't place. It wasn't Latin or anything remotely familiar. Some of the women clapped and murmured, their voices sounding like a reverent chant. Lisa tilted her head in confusion but joined in, hesitant but curious. "What does it mean?" she asked, breaking the rhythm. The hostess smiled, her gaze locking on Lisa. "You don't need a translation to understand. If you close your eyes and open your heart, you'll feel the words. You'll hear his voice, speaking straight into your mind." "His voice?" Sarah asked, breaking her own silence. "Who's he?" The hostess snapped the book shut, glaring at Sarah with thinly veiled disdain. "You've barely joined us, and already you're asking to know his name? You must prove yourself first before you earn the right to speak of him." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her mind racing. "Prove myself? We just got here." The hostess turned away, dismissing the question as her eyes scanned the room. "That's all for today. Come back next weekend for another reading." As Lisa and I walked away from the house, far enough to be out of earshot, I couldn't keep my thoughts to myself anymore. "Lisa, there's something seriously wrong with that book club." "Oh, Sarah, stop," Lisa said with an exaggerated sigh, brushing off my concern like I was being ridiculous. "I'm not imagining things," I pressed. "Those people, they're a cult." That made her stop in her tracks. She turned to face me, arms crossed firmly over her chest, her expression stern. "Sarah, enough," she said, her tone sharper than I'd expected. "If you keep talking like that, people are going to start spreading rumors. Good people could get hurt because of baseless accusations. Why don't you just keep those thoughts to yourself?" "But Lisa," I started, trying to explain. "No. Enough, Sarah," she snapped, her voice final. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched up to her front door. "I'll see you next weekend," she said over her shoulder before disappearing inside, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. I clenched my fists at my sides, frustration and worry churning inside me. How could I convince her? Lisa wasn't taking me seriously. She thought it was all harmless fun or some over-the-top gimmick to make the club more appealing. But I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't leave Lisa alone with those people. Something wasn't right, and even if she couldn't see it, my gut wouldn't let me ignore it. If I wanted to protect her, I'd have to keep attending those meetings and figure out what was really going on. The weekend rolled around faster than I expected, and I found myself running late to the next meeting. When I arrived at the house, I reached out to knock on the door, only to find it slightly ajar. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I nudged it open with my foot and stepped inside. The entryway was dim, the faint glow of light spilling from somewhere deeper within the house. "Hello?" I called softly, but no one answered. I shut the door quietly behind me and crept forward, squinting to make sense of the shadows. Thump, scrape, thump. The sound came from the basement. Beside the staircase, a door stood open, spilling an eerie red light across the floor and walls. My breath hitched as I hesitated, but curiosity, and worry for Lisa, pushed me forward. Each step creaked underfoot as I descended into the glowing depths. At the bottom, I found myself in a wide room, the centerpiece of which was an ominous altar. Lying on top of it was Lisa, dressed in flowing white robes, her eyes closed as if in a trance. My stomach churned at the sight, and I hurried over to her, gently shaking her shoulder. "Lisa!" I hissed, keeping my voice low as I glanced nervously around the room. "You're late, Mrs. Johnson," came a cold voice from behind me. I spun around to see the woman with the sleek ponytail standing at the foot of the stairs, her expression calm but laced with something sinister. My hands curled into fists at my sides as my heart raced. "What did you do to her?" I demanded. The woman's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't know you were capable of such anger. We were doing you a favor." "A favor?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "Lisa is my best friend. Why would I want anything to happen to her?" She let out a soft laugh, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "It doesn't matter what you want," she said, approaching the altar. "You're too late. She won't wake until the ritual is complete. But since you're here, why don't you finish it for us?" She extended a yellowed sheet of paper toward me. The text was written in a strange, ancient language, its symbols jagged and unsettling. "Just read the words," she said. I stared at the page, my mind screaming to refuse. But before I could think, my lips began to move on their own, forming the words that were completely foreign to me. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy as Lisa's body convulsed. Her eyes snapped open, their usual vibrant blue replaced by an endless, pitch-black void. She began to cough violently, blood spilling from her mouth as the sound turned to a sickening gurgle. Cracks and tears echoed through the air as her chest burst open, her ribcage splitting wide. I stumbled back, gasping, but a hand gripped my shoulder, keeping me from fleeing. "Watch with us, Sarah," the woman whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Witness his arrival." The group began to chant, their voices weaving together in a chaotic harmony. "Valgrone! Valgrone! Valgrone!" My mind reeled as the name repeated over and over, their fervor growing. From Lisa's broken body, a grotesque creature emerged, slithering and writhing in blood and viscera. Its body was a horrifying fusion of jagged, blood-stained stone and sinewy muscle. Burning eyes like molten fire stared out from its monstrous face, and curved horns spiraled downward from its skull. Clawed hands, slick with blood, flexed as it moved. When it roared, the sound was a cacophony of death itself, shaking the walls and resonating in my chest. The dread that filled me was overwhelming. My knees buckled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. What have I done? I had released this abomination into the world. This story is from many years ago, back in the 1980s, when I was just a kid. Looking back now, it's hard to make sense of everything, but I've been piecing it together bit by bit. I'm using my old journal entries to help fill in the gaps, though deciphering my messy handwriting as a child is no easy task. One thing is clear: whatever happened left its mark on me and my mom. Even now, decades later, I can't fully shake the feeling of being watched. After I moved out at 18, the strange events started to taper off, but they never fully disappeared. Age 8. It all began when I was 8 years old. I still remember that afternoon like it was yesterday. I had just gotten home from school, my backpack weighed down with homework I didn't want to do. Sitting at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, I found myself unable to focus. My mind kept drifting back to something I'd seen on the walk home, something that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. The day had started like any other. Our neighborhood was old, with sidewalks that were cracked and uneven, forcing me to keep my eyes down to avoid tripping. The smell of hot dogs from the vendor near the school had followed me halfway down the block. By the time I reached the quieter streets, the sounds of the busier roads were fading into the background, replaced by a strange stillness. That's when I saw it, a folded piece of paper lying right in the middle of the sidewalk. At first, I thought it was someone's lost homework, maybe a math problem set or a forgotten note. But when I picked it up and opened it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a drawing. Of me. Not just any drawing, though. It was flawless, almost eerie in its detail. Whoever had drawn it had captured everything perfectly. The messy way my hair always stuck out where the strap of my backpack pressed against it, the small scuff mark on the toe of my left sneaker, and even the way I'd been holding my math textbook against my chest. It wasn't just a picture of me walking. It was like someone had frozen a moment in time and put it on paper. I froze, my eyes darting around the empty street. There was no one, no cars, no neighbors pruning their hedges, not even a stray cat. Just me and the row of quiet houses with their overgrown yards and cracked driveways. My brain scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. How could someone have drawn this? How could they know about the scuff on my shoe or the way I held my book? Part of me wanted to toss the paper away, to leave it on the sidewalk where I'd found it. But something deep inside stopped me. It felt wrong to let it go. Like it belonged to me now, though I didn't understand why. I folded it up carefully and stuffed it into my backpack, my hands trembling as I did. Later that evening, Mom called me to dinner, and for a fleeting moment, I thought about showing her the drawing. But just as quickly, I decided against it. What would I even say? She'd probably laugh it off, or, worse, think I was making it up. Like the time I told her I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window late at night, she said it was probably a raccoon. So I didn't say a word. Instead, I hid the drawing under my bed, telling myself I'd forget about it in a few days. But even as I sit here writing this down, I know that's not true. There's something about it I can't shake, something that makes my skin crawl and my chest tighten. I don't know why, but I can't let it go. It feels like it's mine now, for better or worse. I just hope, in time, I can stop thinking about it. I really hope I do. He jolted awake, the soft hues of morning light slipping past the curtains, chasing away the lingering remnants of the dream that had held him captive just moments before. It was her again. Sophia. Her presence in his dreams had become a recurring theme lately, as if his subconscious refused to let go even as their conversations in the waking world had dwindled. This time, the dream had been vivid, its details still clinging to his mind, refusing to fade. They were seated at a small, wrought iron table, the kind you'd expect to see outside a cafe somewhere picturesque, like Greece. Her hand brushed his lightly across the tabletop, her gaze meeting his with a mix of earnestness and warmth. "I'm glad things are like this," she'd said, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We've come so far." The moment felt so real, yet somehow detached from reality. It wasn't unusual for his dreams to weave versions of himself and others into stories that existed solely in his mind, only to dissolve as soon as he woke. But in this dream, he'd even recalled the day they'd first met, a vivid scene of park swings swaying in the distance, streamers fluttering in the breeze, and a colorful sign proclaiming, "Davonmore Class of 17 Reunion." That wasn't even accurate. He hadn't graduated yet. But the details didn't matter. The dream had made it real. Underneath a cherry tree, she'd caught him glancing her way and walked right up to him. "I saw you looking at me," she'd said, a teasing grin playing on her face. "I want you to know I know, so you don't have to look away when I notice. That way, I can look back." Their first kiss had felt like striking a match near a pile of waiting kindling. From that moment on, they were inseparable, two halves of the same whole through their early adult years. He could still picture the proud smile on her father's face as he shook his hand at their wedding. Now, though, they weren't in Greece or under a cherry tree. They were back at that small table, this time in Central Park. The memory of their past merged into the dream, Sophia's voice pulling him in as she said, "I wouldn't have it any other way." He woke with a start, the vivid recollection already slipping away like sand through his fingers. Rubbing his eyes, he swung his legs out of bed and trudged to the bathroom to prepare for the day. The hours passed in a blur. Classes came and went, not because of excitement or engagement, but because of his half-aware state. By the time he stepped off the bus in the late afternoon, the routine monotony had nearly lulled him into a daze. "How was your day?" Startled, he turned toward the voice. It was Sophia. "Well, it was a day. Honestly, I didn't feel like I was really there most of it," he said, a wry grin tugging at his lips. She laughed softly. "I get it. Sometimes it's like that." They walked in companionable silence, their homes just a few blocks apart. "So we're working on this until 6, right?" she asked after a moment. "Not if we finish before that," he replied with a shrug. "But yeah, 6. They made their way to his room, spreading their work across the desk. As they scribbled away, he couldn't help but steal glances at her. She was intensely focused, her brows furrowing slightly as she worked. Her features were serene yet striking, her confidence apparent in the way she carried herself. He broke the silence. "Almost done with this section?" She looked up, her lips catching his gaze for just a moment. "Yeah, just about. Need to check something?" "Yeah," he said, scooting closer as she pointed to her paper. He leaned in, feeling the warmth of her presence. "Is that what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with something else. It happened before he could think, natural, instinctual, like the world was nudging him toward her. Their lips met, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. Familiar. Then came the pain. It started as a sharp sting but escalated instantly. Blood filled his mouth as her teeth clamped down, tearing into his lower lip. Before he could recoil, her hand shot forward, burying itself into his stomach. A gasp escaped him, half-choked as he doubled over. His hands reflexively moved to his gut, but it was too late. Her fingers plunged deeper, slicing through muscle and tissue like knives. The warmth of his blood spread rapidly, soaking his shirt and pooling on the floor. "Sophia," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. Her face remained eerily calm as she leaned in closer, her eyes locking with his. "I knew this would happen eventually," she said, almost conversationally. "It always does. You just can't let them get any ideas, can you?" His knees buckled, his body slumping to the floor as the world faded to gray. She stood above him, shaking bits of flesh from her hand with a detached expression. The door closed softly behind her, leaving only silence in her wake. And just like that, she was gone. I've always thought of myself as a logical, grounded person. Ghosts? Monsters? Paranormal tales? Nothing more than stories to me. But what happened last month, what's still happening, I can't explain. I'm not sure I'll even live long enough to try. It began with an old photograph. The attic was suffocating, its air thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. A single dangling bulb cast a weak, flickering light over piles of forgotten relics. Boxes spilled over with yellowed papers. An ancient gramophone stood silent in one corner, and rusted trunks lay sealed tight under layers of cobwebs. The shadows stretched and shifted, giving the space an unsettling, almost alive feeling. It was in one of those dim, cluttered corners that I found the photo album, buried under a heap of moth-eaten quilts. I'd been helping my mom sort through my late grandmother's belongings after her funeral. Most of it was junk, old doilies, chipped porcelain figurines, stacks of Reader's Digest from decades ago. Then I stumbled upon the album, its leather cover cracked and peeling. I flipped through it absent-mindedly at first. Black and white photos of strangers stared back at me, stiff poses and hollow smiles frozen in time. Until I saw him. The photos showed a group of children sitting in a semicircle on a lawn, like they were at a picnic. Their expressions were cheerful, their smiles typical for a photo like this. But what drew my attention wasn't them. It was the figure standing just behind the children, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. A man. His face was obscured by a mop of dark, unkempt hair, but his grin, it stretched impossibly wide, the corners of his mouth looking as though they'd been carved into his skin. His eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the flash of the camera like shards of broken glass. He stood slightly hunched, his posture predatory, as though he were waiting for just the right moment to lunge. Everything about him felt wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the image, my stomach twisting with a dread I couldn't rationalize. When I showed the picture to my mom, she barely gave it a glance. "Probably just some neighbor or distant relative," she said with a shrug. "Why? Does he look familiar?" I shook my head. He didn't look familiar. He didn't even look human. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his grotesque grin and those shining, predatory eyes. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. A damaged photo. But deep down, I knew the problem wasn't the photograph. It was him. 3 days later, I saw him for the first time outside the photograph. It was late at night, and I was walking home from work, earbuds in, my head down. The streets were quiet, the occasional flicker of a street lamp breaking the stillness. I turned a corner, and there he was. Standing beneath the dim, flickering streetlight, his grin as wide and unnatural as ever. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. My chest tightened, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crossed the street without looking back, convincing myself it was just some creep trying to mess with me. When I got home, I triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows. That night, he appeared in my dreams. In the dream, I was back in the attic, flipping through the photo album. Only now, he was in every picture. His grin stretched wider and wider with each turn of the page, until it was the only thing I could see. The sightings became more frequent after that. I'd see him in the subway station, standing perfectly still while the crowd moved around him. His reflection appeared in shop windows, grinning back at me even when I turned to look and found no one there. Once, I swerved my car to avoid hitting him in the middle of the road, nearly crashing into a tree. When I checked the rearview mirror, he was gone. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside my window felt like him closing in. Faint, guttural laughter would echo in the silence, just on the edge of hearing. My friends noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at every shadow. "You're just stressed," my best friend Amanda said. "Take some time off. Go somewhere quiet, clear your head." Desperate, I followed her advice. I rented a remote cabin in the mountains and left without telling anyone where I was going. I thought if I got far enough away, I could leave him behind. I was wrong. The first night was uneventful. I kept the lights on and jumped at every sound, but nothing happened. By the second night, I started to believe Amanda was right. It was all in my head. On the third night, the stillness became suffocating. The cabin felt alive, every creak of the wooden floors amplified in the silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural chuckle, soft at first, as if the walls themselves were laughing. I froze, gripping the kitchen knife I'd started carrying everywhere. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it was coming from outside. Against my better judgment, I peeked through the curtains. There he was, standing in the clearing, his grin wider than ever, his glowing eyes fixed on me. He raised a hand and waved. I snapped. I threw open the door and ran into the night, screaming at him to leave me alone. As I got closer, his features began to shift. By the time I reached him, he wasn't a man anymore. He was me. My reflection stared back at me, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes gleaming with mockery. My knees gave out, and I collapsed, the world spinning around me. I don't remember much after that. I woke up on the cabin floor, the knife missing, the front door wide open. I packed my things and left as fast as I could. Now that I'm back home, things have only gotten worse. Every time I look in the mirror, I see that grin. At first, it was small, barely noticeable. But it's growing. Every day, it stretches a little wider. My eyes are starting to change too. They glow faintly, just like his. I don't know how much longer I have, but I needed to write this down. If you find this, if you see me, don't smile back. It's all my fault he's gone. I know it is. I'm 16, and it was my job to keep an eye on him that day. We live way out in the country, in a no-name southern county where nobody goes unless they're lost or driving through. Rudy, our chocolate lab, had always been allowed to roam off-leash. He was well-trained and never strayed far, always returning after handling his business. He was the kind of dog people fall in love with at first sight, big, soulful brown eyes and a red collar that made his coat shine in the sunlight. That's who he was. It started like any normal afternoon. I was home alone since my parents were still at work, so I popped a frozen pepperoni pizza in the oven and let Rudy out to play on our property. We've got plenty of space, trees, open fields, the works. Sitting on the porch, I scrolled through videos on my phone, keeping half an eye on Rudy as he explored. Then it hit me. I'd completely forgotten about the pizza. I bolted back into the house, smoke already curling out of the oven. I yanked open the door to find a blackened mess where dinner used to be. I swore under my breath, cursing my carelessness and scrambling to figure out how to explain to my parents why I'd wasted perfectly good food. In all that commotion, I forgot about Rudy. I was rummaging through the fridge, looking for something else to eat, when the sound came. Tires screeching on the pavement. A car skidding to a sudden stop. And then, that heart-wrenching, pained yelp. Rudy's yelp. My heart dropped into my stomach. I sprinted out of the house, across the yard, and down the driveway as fast as I could. When I reached the road, my knees buckled beneath me. There he was, Rudy, lying in the street, his chest and stomach crushed. The car was long gone, tire tracks and blood smeared across the asphalt as the only evidence it had been there. I knelt beside him, sobbing harder than I ever have in my life, watching him struggle to breathe. His whine slowly faded, his body finally going still as the light disappeared from those big, trusting eyes. Rudy had never wandered to the road before. He'd always stuck to the woods or stayed near the house. If I'd just called him back sooner, he'd still be alive. My parents were heartbroken. I could feel their grief directed at me, even if they didn't say it outright. A week passed, and while we tried to move on, the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. Then, one evening, something happened that made the wound tear open all over again. I was outside, walking around the yard while talking to my friend Josh on the phone. We were joking about something, laughing as the sun dipped below the horizon, when I suddenly felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped, my eyes scanning the driveway. It curved slightly to the left, with thick trees on both sides that blocked the view of the road. Standing at the bend, shrouded in shadows, was a chocolate lab. My heart clenched. The dog had Rudy's same red collar, his fur matted with blood, tire marks visible along his side. But his face, it was completely crushed, barely recognizable. His stomach was torn open, entrails spilling out. I froze. My breath hitched, and Josh's voice on the other end of the line faded into white noise. The dog just stood there, unmoving, staring at me with those same brown eyes. We had buried Rudy far out in the woods, where his grave wouldn't remind us of what we lost every day. He was dead. There was no doubt about it. Was this some kind of hallucination? Was my mind playing tricks on me as it grew darker? I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut as a sob caught in my throat. When I looked back, he was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just guilt messing with my head. I brushed it off with a nervous laugh, finished my call, and hurried back inside. But from that moment on, things were never the same. Since my parents are always working, I catch the bus to school every morning. That means walking down the long, winding driveway to wait at the spot where Rudy died. Every time I walked that path, a chill would creep up my spine. The trees that usually buzz with birds and squirrels were eerily quiet. The shadows felt heavy, pressing in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One morning, as I stood waiting for the bus, the feeling hit me harder than ever. I turned around, and there he was again. Rudy. His mangled body stood closer this time, motionless and silent. He didn't blink, didn't wag his tail, just stared. I backed into the road, terrified, my mind racing with questions. Was this some kind of zombie? A ghost? What did he want? The blaring horn of the school bus snapped me out of my daze. I hadn't even noticed it approaching. The driver slammed on the brakes, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. I screamed and fell backward, landing on the pavement. As I scrambled to my feet, Rudy was gone again. The bus driver chewed me out for not paying attention, and the kids on board laughed at my expense. I didn't care. All I could think about was the way Rudy's presence made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a haunting. It felt like he wanted revenge, like he wanted me to suffer the same fate. That night, I finally told my parents what was happening. Over dinner, I confessed that I kept seeing Rudy, or at least something that looked like him. My mom and dad exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Son, you've been staying up late watching those scary movies," Dad grumbled without looking at me. "No wonder you're seeing things." Mom nodded, her voice softer. "He's right. You're barely sleeping, and you've been missing the bus. Maybe it's time to take a break from the horror movies and get to bed earlier, okay? I agreed, figuring they might have a point. But even after I stopped watching scary movies and tried to stick to a better sleep schedule, things only got worse. I started hearing scratching at the front door late at night. Whining, too, soft at first, then louder, more desperate. My bedroom is closest to the front door, and while my parents slept soundly upstairs, I lay there paralyzed. There was no way a dog should have been out there. Our nearest neighbors didn't own any, and Rudy, well, he was buried. Still, I couldn't bring myself to look. I'm not the kind of person who investigates strange noises. I'm the one who hides, who avoids whatever horror might be waiting. But even without looking, I could tell something wasn't right about the sound. The whining didn't sound like Rudy's, it was deeper, raspier, almost mocking. Whatever it was, it didn't want me to sleep. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to pretend I was imagining it. I'd finally had enough. Sleep deprivation, guilt, and fear all boiled over, and I stormed out of bed, determined to face whatever was making those god-awful noises. If being a horror movie protagonist was the price of a good night's sleep, then so be it. My bare feet hit the floor with deliberate, heavy stomps as I marched toward the kitchen, but before I got there, the scratching and whining stopped, as if Rudy, or whatever this thing was, had heard me coming. My bravado faltered. I hesitated when I reached the kitchen but forced myself to move. Tiptoeing to the window, I craned my neck to peek outside onto the porch. And that's when I saw him. Rudy stood completely still, staring straight at the window as though he'd been waiting for me. My stomach twisted in ways I didn't know were possible. Up close, he looked far worse than I'd imagined. His eyes were hollowed out, black pits that seemed to stare through me. His tongue, now gray and swollen, lolled out of his dislocated jaw like something from a nightmare. I stumbled back with a strangled yell, my heart racing. Without thinking, I bolted upstairs to my parents' room. I shook them awake, sweat soaking through my shirt, words tumbling out incoherently. "What's going on?" Dad asked, groggy and alarmed. "Something's outside," I gasped. "It's Rudy! He's on the porch!" That got him moving. Dad grabbed his old Louisville Slugger from the closet and headed downstairs while Mom and I hovered at the top of the stairs. She clutched her phone, her thumb hovering over the keypad in case she needed to call for help. My pulse pounded in my ears as we listened to Dad fling open the front door and shout into the night. But no scuffle followed. No growling, barking, or anything. Just the sound of Dad muttering to himself. A few minutes later, he walked back into the kitchen, shaking his head. "There's nothing out there," he said flatly. "What exactly did you see?" Mom asked, her skeptical tone cutting through the tension. "Was it a man?" "No," I said, exasperated. "It wasn't a man." "You said he's out there," Dad interjected sharply. "I meant Rudy," I stammered. "I saw Rudy." They exchanged a look, the kind that made my face flush with embarrassment and frustration. "Dylan," Mom started, her voice laced with a tired sigh. "We all miss Rudy." "No, you don't understand." I cut her off, pleading. "He's haunting me. I've seen him. He's out there. It's just your guilty conscience playing tricks on you." Dad snapped, though I could hear the concern beneath his frustration. "I didn't do anything wrong. It was an accident." My voice cracked as I turned and bolted back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me before they could see the tears spilling down my face. Mom followed me, twisting the doorknob. "We'll talk about this after school tomorrow," she called through the door. "And we're scheduling you an appointment with a counselor. You're not fine, Dylan." I collapsed onto my bed, burying my face in my pillow to muffle my sobs. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I'd seen. I didn't just miss Rudy, I missed feeling normal. I missed not being terrified every time the sun went down. The next morning, I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. Unsurprisingly, I missed the bus again. Mom, clearly fed up, silently drove me to school, her lips pressed into a thin line the entire way. When I signed in at the office for being late, one of my friends, Toby, was sitting there, slouched in a chair like he didn't have a care in the world. "You look like hell," Toby snorted, clearly amused. "What are you doing here so late? What are you doing out of class already?" I shot back, irritated. "Got in trouble," he said with a shrug. "It's not even 9 in the morning," I said, shaking my head. "What did you do?" Toby just scoffed. "Whatever, man. At least I don't play with dead dogs." I froze, my head whipping around to glare at him. "What did you just say?" "Whoa, chill." Toby raised his hands defensively, his expression more surprised than mocking. "I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, Alexis was talking about how your dad's been, like, leaving Rudy out by the road to scare people or something. You gotta admit, that's weird, man. What's that about? Is he trying to freak out the little kids on the bus? What the hell are you talking about?" My face went hot, my heart hammering. I could feel sweat pooling at the back of my neck. "My dad's at work before the bus even comes, and Rudy is dead. We buried him in the woods." Toby shrugged again, but his uneasy expression stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Toby frowned, his usual smirk replaced by something closer to unease. "You know, now that I think about it, I've seen your dad before, right? He's that big, broad-shouldered guy. But Alexis said it wasn't him. She keeps saying it was some skinny guy with pale skin, wearing a black hoodie. So, it wasn't your dad moving Rudy around? Didn't you guys, get him stuffed or something? What's that word? Taxidermied?" I muttered, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, that," Toby said, snapping his fingers. "Did you guys do that? 'Cause she said it looked like some freaky taxidermy job. His guts were hanging out and everything. That's not normal, right? We never had him stuffed." I burst out, the words leaving my mouth louder than I'd intended. My hands clenched into fists as the pieces started clicking together. "What exactly did she see him do?" Toby hesitated, his nervousness growing. "She said she saw him come out of the woods and leave Rudy at the end of your driveway this morning. Then he just stood there, smiling as the bus went by. She thought it was some kind of sick prank. Like, to scare the kids on the bus." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My head felt like it was spinning. Everything that didn't make sense before suddenly slammed into place, and the realization hit me like a truck. I didn't waste any time. I practically harassed the receptionist into letting me use the school phone to call my mom. Between sobs and gasps for breath, I told her everything. She called my dad and drove straight to the school to pick me up. By the time we got home, the police were already there. They searched the property from top to bottom, and what they found still makes my skin crawl. Rudy's grave had been dug up. The fresh dirt was disturbed, and his body was gone. The police found him under our house, hidden in the crawlspace, along with evidence that someone had been living there. That's when it all clicked. The scratching and whining I'd heard at night? It wasn't Rudy, it was the guy. He'd been mimicking the sounds of a dog almost perfectly, hiding just under our noses. But the worst part? They caught the guy. He was holed up in the for sale house across the street, the one that had been empty for weeks. When the police took him into custody, he admitted to everything. He'd been watching us, stalking our family for no reason other than his own sick amusement. He confessed to digging up Rudy and stuffing him himself, purposely leaving the gruesome details, the entrails, the broken bones, to make the whole thing more horrifying. Whenever I wasn't looking, he'd move Rudy's body, placing it out in the open and hiding in the trees to watch my reaction. When I started waking up late and missing the bus, he decided to escalate things by leaving Rudy at the end of the driveway for the other kids to see. He told the police he enjoyed their freaked-out faces. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he admitted to killing Rudy in the first place. He laughed as he told the officers how he'd lured Rudy to the road with dog treats, then got into his car and ran him over on purpose. Afterward, he hid the car in a nearby field, accessible by a trail that ran behind the empty house, so no one would connect him to the crime. He'd been squatting in the house for weeks, using it as his base to torment us. He even used his mechanic skills to stuff Rudy, buying supplies with the little money he had left. When they asked why he did it, his answer was simple: for fun. The charges piled up: trespassing, harassment, animal cruelty, and who knows what else. Mom couldn't handle staying in that house after everything. She didn't feel safe knowing that lunatic had been living right across the street, so we packed up and moved not long after. Looking back, I feel so stupid for thinking Rudy was some kind of ghost or zombie. If I'd investigated more or stuck around longer when I saw him, maybe I would have noticed something was off. But I also can't shake the anger at that psychopath for what he did, and anger at myself for not being able to protect Rudy. At least Rudy can finally rest now. We buried him again, this time in a proper pet cemetery. Mom and Dad didn't spare any expense to make sure he had a peaceful resting place. Sometimes, I visit his grave and leave treats there, just like old times. He'll always be a good boy. Always.